Good evening, and thank you everyone for coming. Dr. Anton Treuer is Executive Director of the American Indian Resource Center, I'll just hold it, at Bemidji State University. He has a BA from Princeton University, MA and PhD from the University of Minnesota. He is editor of the Objiwe Native Journal, the only academic journal of the Objiwe language, and author of 9 books to include Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. Dr. Treuer has sat on many organizational boards, including the White Earth Land Recovery Project, Sanford Merit Care Health System, and the Minnesota State Arts Board. Dr. Treuer has received more than 40 prestigious awards and fellowships from many organizations, including the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Bush Foundation, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. So without further ado, Dr. Anton Treuer.
Bonjour. Koya ni maji tayan ni Objiwe machines, we went to go ji, mi go chi bitagosian, akiji in any go jayan. When you go to Manduan, Monkey, oh, Nenda Manduach Gesh Chigang, we went in to watch the Gikanemin down in Shinabe. Meanwhile, go to Vidu Kudading, we went to watch the Gikane the monk. Meanwhile, Shindabu, meanwhile, Megisi and Dode, Nazakaswaji make have in Objiwa, Chiwasa. The one you don't wish Minister Otago and Objiwema. Gabi. Bungi. What? Aha, Objiwema. I guess English. When they asked me to come here, I was really honored, and nobody said anything about doing it in English. All right, I'm really pleased to be here. I address you first in my native Ojibwe language because many people much older, smarter, and wiser than me say that that's what we do. It's one of our indigenous cultural protocols to say our native name, clan, where we're from. That says a lot about who we are. And I've always been astounded going to school in this country, teaching, working, and interacting with lots of people that we often teach our young people more about animals from across the ocean than animals here in North America, more about the Roman Empire than the thousands of years of history of this place, to the point where people don't even know the history of the land that they own and have a house on, much less the entire expanse of the continent. It's really kind of crazy. Evokes some pretty good questions. And I thought today we're going to be talking about the book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. And I really want you to think about whatever questions you have. Good ones, bad ones, there's no such thing as a bad question. And I want to entertain your questions. So you think about those and don't be shy when you come to them, because we're going to spend most of our time answering your questions. All right. Who has had a class on Native American history, culture, something? Some of you, okay. So some of you, not so much, right? It's kind of amazing you can go to school in this country and just get the sugar-coated version of Christopher Columbus and the first Thanksgiving and very little else about the first people of the land. But that is the situation in which we live. I guess I'll share a little bit about the project in this particular book. I went to high school in a town called Bemidji. It's a small town in northern Minnesota, about 10,000 people. So I think that's the entire population of your campus. That was the population of that town. Surrounded by the 3 largest Indian reservations in the state of Minnesota, and that means in geographic size, but also in terms of population. So this town of about 10,000 people was about 30% Native American, although maybe half the shopping population and school population was Native, because the Native kids are busing into the schools and things like that. But it was amazing that the two worlds rarely interacted. They take the kids 250 miles away to the Twin Cities for a school field trip, rather than to one of the neighboring Native communities, like 10 miles away. And it was really strange. Tribal people didn't really interact with, county government or city government very much. There were a lot of strained tensions. I know I had a lot of crazy experiences as a student, mainly from my peers, but sometimes from teachers. Lots of cultural misunderstandings. Sometimes really mean things happened. Like I had a teacher, I had long hair, and I had a teacher who dressed me up like a girl in front of the class in first grade, and everyone had a good laugh. That was my teacher who did that. A lot of mean stuff from my peers. So when I graduated from high school, my thought was, I'm going to get out of Dodge and get as far away from there as possible. I suppose that much isn't that different from the high school experience of lots of people of many different races in this country. So I got into Princeton University, headed out the door. I was so happy. I thought, oh, this will be great. Most of the people who are going to school there have been, educated at some prep school. They'll at least know something about Native people. I won't be getting all this ignorance. And boy, was that naive. Those are the dumbest smart people I've ever met. So there was still all the, where's your tomahawk and all that kind of stuff. It was discarded all over again. And at one point, I was the first Objiwe person, first one from my tribe to go to school there. And I started to get really homesick. There's nothing like leaving home to make you appreciate it a little bit more. And I heard that there was a woman from a different tribe who was coming to the New Jersey woods to run sweat lodge ceremonies. And I thought, well, it'll be different from where I come from, but I'm going to check it out. So I went out there, and to my great surprise, this was in the afternoon, like 3 o'clock, the sun was up. There were about 20 non-Native people, completely naked, waiting to participate in the ceremony, right? So, now I've got a mix of reactions. Part of me wants to laugh, because dang, there's 20 naked people standing around in the New Jersey woods, right? Part of me wants to run, because dang, there's 20 naked people standing around in the New Jersey woods. And part of me was deeply offended. Is that what other people think we're all about? Take off our clothes and run around naked in the woods and play me, So I had this mix of emotions. So now I'm being naive. Decided not to run. I opened the car door. And I was immediately folded into a tight embrace by one of these completely naked strangers who started saying, I'm so sorry for what my people did to your people. So now my emotions are accelerating, right? The desire to either laugh or run or get really mad. And I kind of don't know what to do. But I looked at this lady, and she was an elder, and she was on the verge of tears. And it occurred to me that no matter how misguided she was, and clearly she was misguided, her emotive response was real. She actually did feel bad, and she did care, and nobody ever gave her a bunch of really great information on a silver platter. And it occurred to me, too, that that was probably the experience for most Native, or for most non-Native people. Indians, we are often imagined, but infrequently well understood. So, I said, would you mind putting some clothes on, because I'd love to talk to you about all of this. And she did, and we had a good talk. And I think she came away, because I kept my cool and didn't blow up. But like if I just got mad, she would think Indians are angry people. If I walked away, she'd just keep on imagining. But because we had a real conversation, I think she realizes that we don't strip down naked to be authentic. And that there's a lot to our culture. And that there are actually many Native cultures, not just one. And so I think that made a difference for her too, an impact on her too. Over the years, I've gone through a number of evolutions. I teach Objiwe language, or tribal language, at the university in Bemidji. written a number of books on our language and on history. And I also do a lot of work around our ceremonies and different things like that. I have a big family, 9 children, and 1 grandbaby. I'm a little older than I look. And through all of that, I had lots of interactions with lots of people and lots of questions. Some of them very consistently coming up, like, what is it? Indian, Native American, Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nation person, or what? And there's nothing like not even knowing how to phrase the question to totally paralyze the conversation. People don't even know how to talk about it. To the point where people are so worried about offending somebody, they clam up. The teachers, including the teachers or predominantly non-native teachers, are teaching native kids. Even in a school like Red Lake, which is in northern Minnesota, 100% native kids, 1 native teacher. Everyone else is non-native. And they're so scared of offending someone, they don't teach those native kids anything about their own history or culture. We perpetuate an environment in which we educate native kids for their own assimilation. It's pretty horrifying, really. We haven't come that far from the residential boarding school era in Indian country. And when you look at things like that educational achievement gap, that's part of it. I've got a lot of things to share with you and show you on that. Has anyone ever done a training on something called white privilege? You ever hear that term before? A couple of you? Yeah, sometimes when you say the words white privilege, people bristle. Right? Oh boy, here it comes. Another lecture. I'm going to get beat up for the sins of my ancestors. And there were so many sins. And how can I ever make anything right? So it's just a big guilt trip. That's what people will expect when you hear the terms. Or some people might react by saying, it seems like there's a scholarship for every racial group in the world except for white people. White people are the least privileged of them all. Right? Those are kind of common reactions you might hear. But what's really meant by that is that, first of all, having privileges isn't a bad thing. It's just not right when some people have them and others don't have the same ones. And there's a huge basket of kind of almost invisible privileges that white people have that others don't. They include things like being able to walk into a store and buy flesh-colored Band-Aids and have them actually match the color of your flesh. A little privilege. But only one race really gets that privilege. It means that you could walk into any barber shop and someone will know how to cut your hair. And if you're black, that is not a privilege that you enjoy in every barber shop or beauty salon. So there are little things like that. But there are big things too. Like, I'm usually not an Indian in the room. I'm usually the Indian in the room. I am the barometer upon which my entire race is judged. A white person can talk, can raise hell, can go to a bar, and nobody's going to say, white people. You know? You can have 200 inebriated white college co-eds at the bar down the street, and no one's going to say white people. Man, it's such a problem with drinking. They're probably genetically predisposed. Right? But you can have 200 inebriated white college co-eds and 1 Indian, someone's going to think it. And they're probably going to say it. So there is another privilege. And there are many of these. Right? If a white person gets pulled over by the cops, you can usually be pretty sure it was the broken taillight or the speed and not the race that generated the pullover. If you're a person of color, you can never be entirely sure. And if you're driving around with tribal license plates on your car, you can never be entirely sure. So there are a lot of these things. They also mean things like this. The white race is widely represented in the curriculum, in schools. there are lots of opportunities to learn about your heroes. How many chiefs can you name? Yeah, and if you take out the plains, Chief Joseph, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, how many can you name? Most Americans can't name too many. Maybe a few have done more studying than others. So there's a whole basket of privileges. This is one of the issues in education, especially for Native kids, where going to school, there are so few opportunities to learn about ourselves that it generates disconnection. It feels like education for assimilation. Always learning about others, never about ourselves. Could you imagine if all the white kids in America went to school and learned only about the beauties of Arab culture, Arabic language, the contributions of Arab people to our understandings of mathematics, the zero, navigation, but never got to learn anything about anything good that any white person ever did? Well, for starters, this is the United States of America, so that just wouldn't fly. But that is exactly the experience for Native people. And being told about how great everybody else is, and only receiving negative messages about your own people, slowly, steadily builds a really powerful blow to self-esteem. And that blow to self-esteem is what fuels that so-called achievement gap. One that I think is better thought of as an opportunity gap. The kids aren't dumber. They are just afforded fewer opportunities to receive empowerment in the way we teach. And it's a travesty. And it's not the fault of the kids. But we don't think about that because white privilege. Right? It's one of the privileges. And, I don't know how many Native people you have on campus talking and sharing and so forth, but probably not too darn many. There are so few of us, we cannot possibly do all of the educating, advocating, public speaking, book writing, everything that needs to be done. And when there has been a change in the United States, positive change around race, something like the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of the change happened not because someone like Martin Luther King Jr. was right. He was right. The change happened when you had 250,000 people marching on Washington, D.C., and a lot of them were white. When it wasn't just black people, but a lot of people of different races were saying it's an affront to all of our humanity that this should be going on. Then you had political action. And it still has not completely addressed all of the issues, obviously, but it was a step. So, we need you not to rely on me to do all of the advocating. We need you to take responsibility for educating yourselves and asking for and expecting more out of our K-12 and higher ed education. And when you do that, then you'll see change. Have you ever thought about this one too? It seems to me that, boy, it's really hard talking about the ugly chapters, isn't it? I mean, no individual human being wants to be judged by their darkest day, right? I don't. No nation wants to be judged by its darkest day either. And sometimes we run away from the tough discussions. And it happens in a lot of places. I traveled around Europe, and I was actually really interested in checking out some concentration camps. Anyone ever gone to one? A couple people. pretty powerful. I was pretty surprised when I was in Germany. Most of the concentration camps that the Nazis kept were not actually in Germany, but somewhere. So I went to Dachau, which is outside the city of Munich. And I was kind of amazed that there were no road signs until I was about a kilometer away. Something such a big piece of the history that was so hard to find, physically find. And you go there and like, it still smells like death. Still today. It physically, it stinks. But, and this, you went to Mauthausen, which is in Austria. Austria joined Germany early in World War II. And there were road signs, but maybe about 2 kilometers away. But if you try to go to Auschwitz, which is in Poland, then the signs are 75 kilometers, 50, 25, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Look what the Nazis did to us. It's not that one camp was so much more important and other ones were so not important. But even today, German people really don't like shining a spotlight on that piece of history. It's a darn fine question how the most well-educated and the most literate society in the world came up with the final solution. It's a really hard question. To deal with that in Germany, they had to do things like have the banks that melted down the gold fillings from the teeth of Holocaust victims make financial reparations. They had to issue formal apologies, and they had to mandate instruction about it across the curriculum in the entire country. And it's still uncomfortable. So I get it that it's hard looking at the hard chapters. In some ways, we've made a little bit more progress in the black narrative in America, even in the South. Because we can point to a couple of wins. Okay, for a long time things are really awful, but at least we ended slavery. And then things are really awful, but we tried to end Jim Crow, civil rights movement. And what are the 2 subjects in the black narrative that get into the state curricular standards? Emancipation Proclamation and civil rights movement. And most large cities in America have a street named Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Now, there's some problems because those are the only things that get talked about sometimes, because that buys a lot of complacency about the other really serious issues ongoing in the black community, about that so-called achievement gap there too. But at least there's something positive to talk about. And people like to talk about that. Somehow it becomes okay to talk about what happened to Harriet Tubman, because eventually we freed the slaves. Somehow it's okay to talk about, Rosa Parks, because we eventually shared a dream. People can walk away with the perception, maybe not the reality, but at least the perception that we finally got it right. There is resolution. With the Native narrative, there is no resolution. We have yet to get it right. There is still 82% unemployment on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. People hear that and they say, those poor people. And they go right back to what they're doing. When we had a sustained unemployment rate of 15% in the United States of America, we called that the Great Depression. We got Civilian Conservation Corps, Tennessee Valley Authority, Social Security, a whole slew of public interventions to fix it. For Native people, the Great Depression started in the 1800s and it has never ended. And people don't like to be reminded about what they haven't gotten right yet. It's like taking someone's faults and bringing it out into the open. I think we really need some truth and reconciliation. When there are ugly chapters, we have to do this. It's been imperfect, but we have seen some examples of this in other parts of the world. South Africa with apartheid, a way to validate everyone's story and try to move forward. Talk about a system of white privilege. Familiar with apartheid? I'm getting older, some people don't know anything about it. But there was a whole country that had 4 colored classes with varying degrees of privilege. And even though whites comprised only about 2% of the population in South Africa, they occupied 100% of the positions of political power and economic power. That was the system of apartheid. And there were legislated barriers based on race that prohibited people of the 98% of the population that was not white from holding political office. So they really had a lot of work to do, but they did. In Canada, there was actually a formal apology to the Native community for their treatment in the residential boarding schools. And for those who could document physical or sexual abuse in the schools, actual financial reparations. Hasn't been perfect, but it was a step. In America, we have yet to get to apologies, much less mandated instruction across the curriculum. In fact, when people start raising the issue, the response usually comes across, why don't you forget about it? It all happened in the past. Go home, which to a Native person is really ironic. And it's kind of like this. If you really do want something like truth and reconciliation, let's take an example. Like, let's say there's a guy who goes out and cheats on his wife. And then he wants to reconcile the relationship. What happened to Native people's worse than being cheated on in marriage, but an analogy. If he really wants to reconcile that relationship, he will never be successful if he starts with, forget about it, it all happened in the past. All right? He's got to say, I'm sorry. And say it in a way that sounds like he really sincerely means it. And then he's got to say, it's never going to happen again. In a way that says, he really means it. And then he's got his 10% chance to reconcile that relationship. So I think Native people are ready to reconcile. But forget about it, it all happened in the past. It makes people recoil from that. So you forget it, you don't understand me. You don't understand us. Why should I talk to you? And people recoil and it hurts it. Until about 20 years ago, there were no official English language declarations for any states in America. Today, there are over 30. Mainly this has been a response to illegal immigration and to demographic shift. A lot of people are just not comfortable with the eroding percentage of the population that is white or that is English speaking. So there are protection measures going out there. But for people like me who still speak a tribal language, that feels like a terrible blow, slap in the face, an effort to continue and accelerate the ongoing war on our culture and language. It makes us feel like we're not welcome in this country, our own land. So people don't think about things like that. And it gets worse. There's, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Sand Creek Massacre, but this one took place out in Colorado with the Cheyenne. It was really an awful one. Lots of people killed, lots of children were killed. Horrible mutilations carried out by the soldiers. like cutting the genitalia off of the women who were killed and making them into hat bands. And the Colonel Shivington, defended the practice of killing children, saying, you gotta do it, nits make lice. So it's awful. Now just this past year, there's a big debate in the Colorado legislature. The tribal communities there wanted the state government to declare that act and the treatment of Native people as an act of genocide, an attempt to exterminate another people. And the Colorado legislature ended up voting not to call it an act of genocide. They called the event a tragedy. So after all these years, sometimes it's still really hard to take that first step. Truth and reconciliation, it starts with truth. And some people don't want to talk about the truth, even if it's really ancient history. I think in part because there isn't a sense of resolution in the Native story. And we got a lot of work to do. I really do believe in the essential goodness of human beings. And I believe that things are actually a lot better in many regards. But there's a fundamental tension in our country that we really need to think about. Because if we just sit here passively, there's some really profound changes going on. Profound economic ones, like the gaps between those who have and have not, are growing wider and wider and wider, to the point where some segments of our population are so fundamentally at odds and politically at odds, where it is hard to have unifying political or social discussions. That's ongoing. The correlation between the haves, those who have money, and those who have education, is tighter and tighter and tighter. And the difficulty of Hispanics, blacks, and natives, even more so, to penetrate into the ranks of the educated is getting worse and worse in many ways. We can't just passively lament that and say, what a terrible thing. Hope somebody does something about it. And we have to be really careful, because on the one hand, I've never met an elder of any race who did not shake his or her head and say, kids these days. So there's a tension about cultural change for all people. At the same time, sometimes that gets mixed in with all the worries about demographic shift. The browner a county gets, there goes my neighborhood. And there is an effort not just to kind of stay blind to systems of privilege, but to outwardly and politically defend them. Steps in the direction of apartheid. I think it would be hard to accomplish apartheid in a country like America. Well, some people would be really happy if we could. Some. But take, for example, this law, Arizona 15-112. Anyone ever hear about that one? Arizona's come up with some real doozies. Holy man. They had one that said racial profiling is okay if someone looks like an illegal immigrant, pull them over and check. In a state with one of the largest native populations. Boy, in the dark, it's really hard to tell the difference. But 15-112 bans the teaching of ethnic studies in the state of Arizona. There's a law, and the law is really messed up in 100 different ways, but it says it's illegal to create a program or sustain a program that is designed exclusively for students of one race. And it's really messed up because, among other things, when you jettison all the ethnic studies, hello, white is a race too. There are all the disservices done, like they dismantled the Raza Ethnic Studies program in Tucson. They took the books and they put them in a storage locker and confiscated them. Teachers were terminated. And regardless of how you feel about the program, it could even be the worst program in the world. The fact that any teacher's First Amendment freedom of speech rights could be trampled upon so easily should make us all concerned about how powerful our Constitution and Bill of Rights really is to protect all of our freedoms. If white people aren't concerned about that, maybe they'll be more concerned when they are the minority. It's important to have minority rights protected and freedom of speech protected for everybody, no matter how small their voice is. So there's a fundamental erosion of basic principles in our Constitution with that law, which has so far withheld the tests in the courtroom. There's also the really sad fact that it's not just that we are now officially engineering education for assimilation. You can only learn about the white narrative. But there's also the fact that all the white kids in Arizona are now getting prepared for some fantasy land that will never exist, instead of the world in which they will actually live and operate. This should give us all great concern. And it's happening in many places. France, another long, well-established democracy, has officially banned the wearing of traditional Muslim clothes in the streets of Toulouse as a matter of public policy. There's a law that says you cannot dress like a Muslim if you're a Muslim. Remember the 77 kids killed in Norway a couple years ago? All of whom were children of liberal political party members who favored open immigration. Someone was trying to send a message. So if we cannot find a way to project a message of inclusion, we're in for some real trouble. And instead of trying to legislate a certain language or a certain culture, maybe we need to think about core values. To me, the greatest thing about our country is not our ability to assimilate everybody into one monoculture, but our ability to tolerate linguistic diversity, cultural diversity. And it's in the teaching of tolerance that we can be strong. I mean, even Ronald Reagan said there's be nothing like an alien invasion to make us all get on the same page again. And what he was meaning was not a statement about illegal immigration, but some other from another planet could unite us, a sense of bigger issues. And I think he was onto something about that, in the sense that we can see our shared humanity when we think about bigger issues, instead of getting lost in the weeds about, people speaking that whatever, in the grocery store, you know, and the next thing you know, power is a new legislative othering. Big issues. All right, now I can really rant and rave. I kind of got serious on you guys. But there have got to be a lot of questions out here. I guess with the book itself, they're really broken into a wide range of subjects. I'll give you a couple disclaimers and then we'll take your questions for the rest of our time. One of the disclaimers is there is no such thing as the negative perspective on anything. Just like you couldn't say, what do white people think about abortion, good or bad? It's not that simple, right? There's a diversity of opinion, emotionally charged opinion, and so too, well, you have a diversity of opinions in Indian country about anything. Casinos, per capita payments, mascots, whatever. And I'm happy to take questions on any and all of those. Got lots of stuff loaded in the PowerPoint we can show you. So that's one thing. I only claim to speak for myself. Also, you saw how big the book is when you're coming in. There's no way you can say everything there is to know about anything in a book that big. But what I have done is kind of taken the questions I've been getting over the past 20 years or so, and keeping them in a shoebox and kind of sorting them out. And so some are terminology questions. People always want to know about the names of the places where they live. They want to know about how do we broach the subject. They'll want to know about all kinds of stuff. Some are about politics, because one thing that's really different for Native communities is that we're not just cultural enclaves like the Amish. We also have distinct governments. Governments that were here before the United States of America came into existence. So that means, in some cases, different laws around hunting, fishing, all kinds of things. So people want to know, how does that work and how did we get where we're at today? I've got to tell you, most lawyers don't get it. So there's a lot of stuff on that. There's some on economics, because boy, that's confusing. On the one hand, a lot of people think Indians are all rich from casinos. On the other hand, people think Indians are all living in squalor out in Pine Ridge. And both can't be 100% true. So, what is the economic landscape like in Indian country? What's life like in different places? When people want to know about culture, traditional tribal religious beliefs and practices, do people still live off the land? How? Where are the real Indians? Yeah, if I took this off, would anybody think I'm a real Indian? So there are issues about identity, tribal language. Sometimes people want to know about what's the status of tribal languages, how many were spoken, how many are spoken, how many will be spoken 100 years from now. What's going on around all the hot button issues, mascots, the big one, other things. So they're kind of broken into sections there. And then also kind of profiling some of the recent efforts around education, grassroots community work, some of which is really, really inspiring. So that's kind of the lay of the land for that particular book. And now I'm ready for some questions. I got lots of other stuff to show you if you get shy or Indianish, as they say, but I'm sure you'll have some. Who wants to get us started? Yep.
What is your opinion on the Washington Redskins?
Yeah, what's my opinion on the Washington Redskins? All right, this is my opinion. And one of the things to say is that there is not universal agreement, even in Indian country. I believe we need to get rid of that term, and I believe we need to get rid of the use of Native Americans as mascots for sports teams in general, even with the Indians and other groups. And here's why I think that. The two biggest defenses of the use of Native Americans as mascots for sports teams are, hey, we're trying to honor Native Americans. And some of those Indians have Native mascots for their teams too. And what about the Vikings and the Fighting Irish and things like that? All right, those are the biggest defenses I can put out there. And I'll say this, if there is any racial group or ethnic group or cultural group being used as a mascot, and members of that group are really and truly offended, then we should get rid of it. Ideally, something like sports should be unifying, not marginalizing. Unfortunately, that's not what happens. Most Native people that I talk to really are offended. There's an organization called the National Congress of American Indians. They have representation from all 561 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and they've passed resolutions overwhelmingly that repudiate the use of the word Redskins and repudiate the use of Native Americans as mascots for sports teams. So although anybody can go find an Indian somewhere who will say, doesn't bother me, large representative organizations have said, yes, it does bother us. That's one thing. Bear in mind, too, in sports culture, First of all, there's the issue with the home team, right? People are going to dress up like an Indian, chicken feather headdresses. There's actually a whole culture to feathers. Each one used to be earned with a deed of service or protection in warfare. And so this mockery really feels like a mockery. You've got the literal red paint. There's the, Chief Wahoo. I'm going to skip through these because we'll just kind of go around topically on some of the issues here. Oh, there's some good stuff here. I like this. Oh, yeah, there's Chief Wahoo. Does he look like me? Is someone trying to do an authentic representation and honoring of me? Or somebody making fun? Is somebody doing a caricature, not a real character? I'm hoping that's obvious. That is a caricature, a cartoon, and not a legitimate or honorable or honoring representation of me. So there's that, what the home team does. But bear in mind, sports are competitive, and the opposing teams necessarily defile their opponent's mascots in the name of school spirit or team spirit. So when the UMD Bulldogs were playing the Fighting Sioux a little over a year ago, it was the opposing fans who were chanting smallpox blankets, slay the squaws. Smallpox blankets being a reference to germ warfare when General Amherst sent blankets infected with smallpox to tribes that he was battling as a way to cull their numbers and kill them off. Germ warfare in the Great Lakes. There's a big issue with the use of the word squaw. I mean, any word that, like Jewess, negress, squaw, is used to gender differentiate and racially differentiate, they've all got problems. But the word squaw has one of two possible origins, one being that it's a word from the Mohawk language for female genitalia. The other possibility is that it derives from an Algonquian word for woman. Even if that's the most likely word, it's the usage of the word and the othering around both gender and race that's an issue. There's much more we can say about that. But it's a serious issue. A personal one. Most crime in America is white on white, black on black, and so forth. One really notable exception is crimes of sexual violence directed at Native women, which are predominantly perpetrated by white men. So you will be very hard-pressed to find a Native family for whom, quote unquote, being treated like a squaw is not deeply personal and very painful. So imagine me sitting in the stands at that game, trying to explain to my kids why all their neighbors are chanting stuff about squaws. And if you could imagine that being at all uncomfortable, ask yourself, why should a sporting event be uncomfortable around race and gender, when sports really should be unifying rather than marginalizing? And bear in mind, anyone of any race can be ignorant on the issues. National Football League, the ranks of players, black people are well and disproportionately represented, as they are among the ranks of announcers. And on this particular issue, the silence is deafening. You can find white people who are talking about, teaching about, and trying to rectify systems of white privilege. You can find black people who are concerned about the use of redskins. But there's an issue of privilege there too. Privilege not to be well informed on the issue or its impacts in the community. So, to me, holy cow, especially with K-12 institutions, if you are marginalizing even one kid, you shouldn't do it. If you are jeopardizing the financial stability of your entire school district by being vulnerable to a lawsuit over an issue of significant controversy, you should not do that. The mission should be to educate children for the future, a future that can only be imagined, but which we know will be diverse. Indians are imagined, not deeply understood. So bringing your children to a game will be exposing them to one of the only reinforcements about Indian stuff that they will get. Why would you want to create environments that are reinforcing negative stereotypes? That's just pulling us all further apart instead of building bridges to bring us together. It's just not worth it. And people get dismissive and say, why don't you just go home and get a sense of humor and forget about it and quit trying to PC us to death. And I found an Indian who said that it doesn't bother him. You can actually even find a tribe, the Seminole tribe, voted to give permission to the University of Florida for the use of their tribal name. But to me, those are exceptions rather than the rule, and overwhelmingly the response from Native communities has been really clear on it. So I think we just got to go. Other questions? Yeah.
I have a multi-part question as it relates to my senior thesis that I'm in right now.
Yeah.
So I want to know for your tribe, is there a native term that would describe what has become known as two-spirit in the English language? And what was their role, if so, pre-colonialism and in modern times? And how is their acceptance within your native community? And is there homophobia as it's linked to assimilation? And has this changed recently? Has any tribes passed laws in support of same-sex marriage? There you go.
Great questions. First of all, I'll say this. Native Americans are humans like everybody else. That means they can be just as beautiful and just as ugly. And I have met plenty of Native people who are homophobic or racist or whatever. But looking at and having had a chance to study historic Native communities, I have to say that there's a lot of evidence that different understandings of gender, not just gay and lesbian, but really multiple gradations of gender, were much more not just tolerated, but accepted. That's just the way some people were. If you get a chance to read like George Catlin or some of the other like 19th century, middle of the 1800s stuff. Yeah, the dance in honor of the Burdash and stuff like that. And you have to like read it with a grain of salt because he's speaking in the language of the times. But he observed honorings for people of a different gender. And if you look at old Jesuit relations and stuff like that, there's a lot of evidence to support a much wider acceptance of people who had a different outlook on gender in historic Native communities. I won't say that they're perfect by any means. It's really dangerous to denigrate. It's also really dangerous to romanticize. I have to say that Native communities today are significantly impacted by modern mainstream culture. So you'll find homophobia, and you'll find plenty of gay bashing talk and things like that. But I do think, and this is not just because some of the Native communities tend to be a little bit more liberal in the northern plains and Great Lakes, a little different in Oklahoma and in Arizona, actually, politically. But at the same time, there's actually one of the tribes in Oklahoma has opened the door for tribally sanctioned gay marriage in their tribal court, and kind of trying to pave a way in a state that's really pretty conservative to open that path forward. So depends on where you look, what you'll see. But I think culturally there's a lot of evidence to support a much more tolerant and different perspective on gender in general. There's a lot more to say about it. I don't want to spend all our time just on that one subject, but it's pretty fascinating. In Objiwe culture, the tribe, my tribe, there was a pretty strongly gendered division of labor. What was considered men's work, women's work, and people who were cross-gender, the words we had and still use in kazo and kazo would kind of be like a man who functions like a woman in society, according to traditional gender roles, and vice versa. And so there was actually a place in the cultural configurations around gender that cut across sex. But great questions.
Thank you.
Yep. More? Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm curious about what you think about Westerners studying shamanism and that whole movement and Westerners doing the sweat lodge and the more spiritual practices.
Yeah, the question is about non-native people studying shamanism or trying to get engaged in traditional native religious beliefs and practices. I have a few thoughts. One of them is that, unfortunately, especially in Europe, the earth-based religious practices are really stamped out, with just a few, kind of vestigial remnants of, the Druids or something like that. And a lot of it's more imagined than passed on through generations. And the religious opportunities, the primary religious opportunities that are out there, whether it's Christian, or Jewish faith traditions, or even the Muslim stuff, a lot of the people that I talk to, not everybody, but a lot of the people I talk to feel like there's religion, and there's morality, and there's guidance, but what a lot of people have a harder time accessing is spiritual connection. That's not for everybody. I know people who, Catholics who go to take communion and feel something deeply spiritual happening. Ceremony, we're going to have to back that off a little bit. The Hopi used to be like that, and the Pueblos, a lot of their stuff was wide open for spectating, but they had to really ratchet it down because they were just getting overrun. And it was their culture for sale to the point where they couldn't even practice how they had been. So it's important to be careful. It's important to be respectful and have an open mind as somebody who reaches out and seeks that. And then it's important to listen to what Native people are saying about their own rules. But my tribe is a little bit in between. They're not super conservative, they're not super liberal. So for example, if somebody's in Minnesota and they want to check out a social or secular event like a powwow, if that's wide open, anybody can go. If somebody wants to go to a sweat lodge ceremony, those are usually pretty open. Once you get to know somebody and get invited, you're in, and race is not a barrier. We have some ceremonies that are ceremonial drums, which are supposed to be shared between people of different cultures, so non-native people are invited and brought and encouraged to learn about the teachings of the drum, which a lot of them have to deal with peace, things like that. Peace between peoples and protection. But then we also have our primary religious society, and that's reserved exclusively for Native people. So different rules around different things, but I encourage people to be open and respectful as they seek answers. I have to say that the cultural toolbox that's out there is beautiful. And for me, I have 9 children, and we spend a lot of our time doing that. So all of my kids know how to run a sugar bush. We harvest maple sap and cook it down into syrup and sugar every year. My 10-year-old could run the whole show. They're pretty deeply knowledgeable. They snare rabbits, they hunt deer, they do all kinds of things. We harvest wild rice. Try to get as much of our food as we can off the grid, although we're not so dogmatic that we don't go to a store or something, although bullets are cheaper than buying meat by the pound. But in the practice is something really beautiful. I'll just give you one quick example. We do a first kill feast. So we just did one of these for one of my sons who got his first deer. It used to be the case where we cooked the entire deer, sent tobacco throughout the village, and you'd have 100 people show up for your feast. Nowadays, people are a little bit more dispersed because we don't actually all live in teepees. Have houses and they're a couple miles apart, spread out over a larger area. And so, we'd have namesakes and aunts and uncles and grandparents. And at the feast, my son's there, and his mother takes a spoon of the food, we'd pray, and then she'd hold up some of the food and say his Indian name. And he'd have to refuse the first bite and say, "No, I'm thinking of children who don't have enough to eat." Okay, put it back, take another spoon, say his Indian name again, and he refuses the second time. "No, I'm thinking of elders who can't get out into the woods to hunt for themselves." Okay, put it back, take another one, offer it again. "No, I'm thinking about my family and my community, the people who came here today to support me." Put it back, offer another bite, and then he can eat. And then they'll say, "You just changed your life. Up until today, you were dependent on everyone else in this room to provide all of your food. And today, you're providing for all of them." That is what it means to be a man. You take care of other people. You're not hunting for horns. When you acquire food by taking the life of an animal, by harvesting a plant, or by earning money and purchasing it, you have a responsibility now to think of children who don't have enough, elders who can't go out and get it for themselves, your family and your community. And then you can give away his entire first kill. Doesn't get to keep any of it. And then he's given a whole bunch of teachings and lectures about how to hunt and how to care for things. And really empowering. We have similar ceremonies, and boys and girls do the first kill feast. We have other months as people come of age, and there's actually the girls go through when they get their first period. Yeah, there are all kinds of fasts. So as traditional foods come into season, there's a whole year of prohibitions and kind of do's and don'ts and so forth. But they're accompanied by so much empowerment teaching that it's like when you try to push two magnets together, how they repel each other. You are infused with power. It's the power to bring life into the world. It can interfere with other powers. It could affect a berry crop in an area or a wild rice crop. So she has those feasts every time a traditional food comes into season. And at the end, all those aunties and grandmas, they're there with a bunch of teachings. And some of them are simple. It's not just do's and don'ts, but they'll say, when you see a bunch of women sitting around, you come over and sit with us. You belong. You're one of us. They'll say things like, you have a right and a responsibility to be respected by men. Here is what that means. No one can hit you. No one can call you names. No one can make you do something sexually that you do not want to do. And I gotta say, if we did these for all of our young girls, the world would be a different place. And if their brothers are sitting there listening to their sisters get it, this world would be a different place. So the cultural toolbox has lots of empowerment. And ultimately, this is a problem with our modern culture. We raise children and encourage them to be responsible adults. But we don't often enough tell them what it means to be an adult. And without lots of reinforcement for what it means to be a responsible adult, they will assume that your rites of passage are the things that you are denied when you're young. And it's not just driving a car, it's drinking and having sex. Because those are things that adults get to do that kids don't. And so much of our middle school and high school culture is consumed by people who are obsessed with those two things. It's really unhealthy. But when people are shown this is what it means to be a man. This is what it means to be a woman. And you've got all these other people in the culture that are reinforcing that. It's really powerful and really helpful for parents. So it's such a shame that, and it's so wrong, that that culture was warred upon so fervently by our government and our educational institutions. We got a lot of work to do, and I really believe that we can. Am I like running way over on time, or we're good? Okay, a few more minutes, take a couple more questions. Okay, I'll take a couple more. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
What's your favorite Indian folktale?
Favorite folktale? Well, I gotta say, in our tribe, we have a really rich storytelling tradition, and there's a character named Objiwe. He's half human and half spirit, and he has powers kind of like a spirit, but he also has an ego like a human being, so he's always getting into trouble and causing mischief. And so there's a whole bunch of stories around him that are really fun. They're entertaining, but they're also, they're also have important messages. So I like all of those. We have, believe it or not, when we have ceremonies, our main religious ceremony has lots of talking, like a 6-hour-long lecture. 6 hours. Isn't that crazy? And they've never written it down. It's only passed on orally. One of my jobs is I got to tell the story when we have those ceremonies. It's really something to see. Yeah.
I was curious about the present state of like the K-12 schools on your reservation, and what are like the continuing policies and practices from the Indian boarding schools, and what would you like to see change in the future?
Wow, that's a great one. The question is about education, what it's like and what it should be like. Right now, the achievement gap, I can show you a couple things, maybe this will be even faster, is really a horrific situation. Let me see here, I think I dropped these in a little further down. Oh man, there's so much cool stuff to show you guys. I intentionally lowered way more in here than I could possibly show you. There you go. Captain Richard Henry Pratt, he was superintendent of the first residential boarding school for American Indians. When that policy started, this is something that's different for Native people than for all other racial groups in the United States. I think for Black Americans, education is seen as an opportunity that for a long time was unfairly denied. And there have been lots of problems in our deliverance of education to the Black community. For Native people, education is a tool that was used to assimilate. And it caused lots of damage. They brought kids from all over the country to places like Carlisle. This is just an old army fort in Pennsylvania. And people were beaten for speaking the only languages they knew. They had a physical makeover. This is the same person. So day one, they cut off the hair, burn up the traditional clothes. It did so much damage. People were raised for 12 years in these institutions, disconnected from their parents, raised with lots of harsh physical discipline and no nurture. How do people learn how to parent? But by how they are parented. Doesn't mean you can't break the cycle. Lots of Native families have, but they've done it in spite of government policy rather than because of it. So, that did a lot of damage. Let me just, I might have to back out here and find where I put my slides on. Oh, here they are. On the achievement gap. This is, I'll just go through a couple of these. These are just 4th grade scores on the bottom, 8th grade scores on the top, tracking from 2003 to 2011. And probably the most significant thing about this data, this is for Native students, is that that line is flat. What we're doing across this country from one year to the next is not slowly, steadily, incrementally increasing the competence of Native kids in that subject. It's the same story around math, but that line is flat. And these are national graduation rates here, broken down by racial group. On the top is Asian and white, no surprise. This is your median line for all students in gray. And the Latino achievement rates have been picking up a little bit. These are high school graduation rates. The black rates have been picking up a little bit, and that native line is still flat. And at the bottom. What we're doing is not working. And what we are doing is assimilation. I'm going to cruise right back up here and show you a couple more. So I think because the introduction of this material and education in general to Native people was designed to assimilate, you have a disconnection. I can't tell you how many times I heard that the more educated I became, the more of an apple I became. Red on the outside, white on the inside. Education was seen as a marker of assimilation. The better dressed I was, the more that Native and non-Native people would assume that I would know nothing about my tribal culture or language. Now I get to open my mouth and talk a lot, and then that starts dispelling the rumors right away. But that would be the assumption. In fact, I remember one time I was talking in France, there's this guy who's really excited, wanted to ask a question. And French guys never seem to get excited at academic talks. I said, okay, what's your question? And he said, Monsieur, where are the real Indians? I said, where are the real Indians? I said, where are the real Frenchmen? Because there's a castle across the road, but there's nobody living in it. And there was too, this big, beautiful castle, and there's nobody living in it. I said, I don't see guys riding up and down the street on horses and shining armor. I don't even see guys with berets and little pipes. Where are the real Frenchmen? Right, so he's thinking for a minute, and then I think he got me that, I don't have to look like I stepped off the set from Dances with Wolves to be a real Indian. And what it means to be French is something carried on the inside in connection to land, France, and language, that is French, and those are bigger markers of identity. And what it means to be French has changed over time, but is still very French. We get to change over time too, and still be very Native. Although we do always have to ask ourselves, how much can a people change and still be the same people? It's a hard question, but an important one. So, to get more directly to your question about education, we are still doing education for assimilation. It boggles my mind that after 500 years, we know so much about this story. Christopher Columbus wrote letters, kept journals, so did all these other people. We know they cut the hands off of 30,000 people in Columbus's second voyage for failure to meet a gold dust tribute. We know that the indigenous population of Hispaniola, what's now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the Spanish estimated at 2 million people and was reduced to about 25,000 just in the first couple decades. It's genocide. But for some reason, we're still doing this one. This was used in the Milwaukee Public Schools a few years ago, and I pulled it out of their curriculum pack. Indian, Chris, this land is your land, this land is mine. Somehow, we still have a hard time talking about the ugly chapters. And it's not just education for assimilation. Although, boy, it's that. In this particular story, there's more to say. This is the statement from George Bush Sr. And just the highlighted words say a lot. Momentous year, greatest achievements of human endeavor, discovery. How can you discover a place densely inhabited by other human beings? Set an example for us all. Monumental faith. Monumental feats, perseverance, faith, support, quincentenary. 500 years and we still can't seem to get that story, right? That alienates, that marginalizes. Even the schools that are predominantly Native or 100% Native are predominantly taught by non-Native people. It's hard to get the role models in there. There's a shortage of qualified Native teachers, but there's a prejudice in the system against teaching around and validating tribal histories, culture, language. Yeah.
I was going to say, wasn't George Sr. the one who came up with Native American History Month? Was he the one that brought that out?
Yeah, it came at the 500th.
Okay, I thought he was the one that came up with that. Well, what is your perspective on the month?
I think every day is Native American History Day, and every month is Native American History Month. But, you know, as far as commemorations go, I certainly don't object. I think, you know, even on something like Columbus Day, if we were really getting Columbus and not just celebrating some sugar-coated version of that, it would be good. But yeah, we need to really empower Native voices in the story and educate everybody so they can everybody can have a role in, you know, making the next 500 years different. And I believe we can do that. We still got work to do because a lot of times people don't know enough to know what they don't know. And that stuff is really killing us. This is the seal, Great Seal for the territory of Wisconsin. Minnesota and Wisconsin were one territory initially. Most of you probably don't know the story of the Ho-Chunk Indians who are indigenous to Wisconsin, but they endured 9 separate removal orders. On the last one, they were loaded on steamships, sent down the Mississippi River, up the Missouri to Santee, Nebraska. And the tribal population split now between Wisconsin and Nebraska. But here's an Indian looking west at the steamship. You've got a white farmer industriously plowing the land, state house in the background, and there's a caption here in Latin that says, "Civilization succeeds barbarism." Sometimes that ugly stuff is celebrated. I'll just show you this one. This is the Great Seal for the state of Minnesota, still our active seal. The territorial seal is long gone now for Wisconsin. But it evolved out of Wisconsin state seal. You don't have the steamship, but you got the Indian riding west into the setting sun. You got the white farmer industriously plowing the land with a wary eye on the Indian. You've got a stump, an axe. You've got a gun, symbols of deforestation and physical violence over the land. The captions in French, "Les toiles du Nord." Every kid in the state of Minnesota must learn about this state seal. It's in the curricular guidelines. I can almost guarantee you that nobody's teaching it the way that I just taught it to you. We're still educating for assimilation. There's an Objiwe language immersion school in Hayward, Wisconsin. And they teach all of the state mandated curriculum. They just do it in the tribal language. Across the nation, about 50% of Native kids are not passing state mandated tests in English and in math. But at that school, for 14 years in a row, they've had a 100% pass rate at state mandated tests in English, administered in English, even though their teachers are teaching them in Objiwe. Isn't that amazing? It seems very counterintuitive, but it has to do with what I've been talking about with cultural disassociation. When people get to learn about themselves, that builds self-esteem. That generates engagement. They're getting Native role models in front of the kids. The parents are being more trusting of the school because they're teaching validating stories. They're still rigorous on their academics, and they're producing the results. So we can point at all the things that aren't working, but if somebody's finding something that is working, maybe we should pay more attention to that. So to me, more room for differentiated instruction, more room for multicultural instruction. It's really, really important for all people to get more comfortable operating in multiple environments. Chinese people are very successful at business, and they didn't have to abandon being Chinese to be successful at business. Native Americans do not have to abandon their tribal language and culture to be successful in America, in business, in politics, or in anything else. And there's been an often deeply ingrained belief that what's native is holding the natives back. A deficit orientation towards tribal culture, and that's a problem. All right, I'll take one more, and then we should wrap it up, because we have food to eat, books to sell, and I want to say too, before I take the last question here, that I'm really, really excited and honored to be here and be part of this discussion. I also have cards back there. You can grab them. There's no way to handle all of your questions, so of course that's why we're shamelessly selling and promoting the book. But you can also grab the cards and shoot me emails if you have questions. You know, we're just scratching the surface on some of this, but it's important to start the conversation. So I'll take one more question and then a couple closing remarks and move on.
Yeah, I just, since Thanksgiving's coming up, I would like to hear what you recommend to the K through 12 teachers that you do your sessions with. How do you recommend that they children?
Yeah, great question. Since Thanksgiving's coming up, how do we handle that one? I guess first of all, I encourage people to get informed. You know, those working in K-12 education, there are some great resources out there. There's a book called Rethinking Columbus, which is published by Rethinking Schools. They're based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And it's a great curriculum packet, because you don't have to put the picture with the hand chopping and stuff like that and tell your 5-year-old's coloring the blood. You know what I mean? Like, there are appropriate ways to engage each age group, and that's on Columbus and on Thanksgiving and other stuff. The story around Thanksgiving is a little bit complicated and confusing. On the one hand, that initial Native Puritan exchange, there's something real about the mythologized story that Native people were sharing ideas about crop rotation and farming. They provided important interventions that enabled the first waves of people to survive. Although the evidence of the first Native Puritan joint harvest celebration is actually a number of years after it was mythologized to be there. It wasn't the first year the Puritans arrived. Several years later was the first evidence of a joint harvest celebration. And the national holiday stuff kind of evolved in stages. And during the Roosevelt administration and so forth, it got official. So, you know, it's complicated. And then the people of New England warred against the native inhabitants. So at the center of the Thanksgiving story is this guy, King Philip, whose head was put on a pike at the village of Plymouth for 20 years. So obviously there's more to that story than just the mythologized version. So it's good to be aware of that. Books like Rethinking Columbus have some good material on Thanksgiving, as well as Columbus, and constructive ways. Like with the young kids, it's really a good entry point is talking about a validated place for Native people in everybody's story. So for example, Native people introduced the obsidian scalpel and trephination surgery to the rest of the world. Like if there's blunt force trauma to the head and you trephinate the wound and relieve the pressure, you can save someone's leg. So that knowledge advanced European medical practices, and the obsidian scalpel still used in modern medicine today. Native foods revolutionized the rest of the world. Potatoes, corn, tomatoes, turkey, all kinds of stuff. And so there are easy, soft entry points for some of that stuff. And as they get older, then you can roll up your sleeves on the tougher stuff. So I encourage people to do that. All right, I'm going to introduce you to one guy, and then we'll wrap it up. In the town where I come from, I got to say, you heard me when I started talking about some of the tensions in the community around issues of race and how hard it was for me going to school. Whoops, there's a guy I wanted to introduce you to. His name's Michael Mewers. He's a non-native guy. And things were really bad in Bemidji for quite a long time, but a few years ago, he said, you know what, when people go to Hawaii, everybody knows what aloha means. So when people come to northern Minnesota, everyone should know what ani and buju and miigwech mean. So he started campaigning for bilingual bathroom signs and road signs and welcome signs and things like that. And to make a long story short, it worked. I think it actually helped that he was non-native because he wasn't threatening. Like if I walked in the door and started ranting, they'd be like, please don't hurt me. You know what I mean? But he was not threatening. And to make a long story short, we have a small town, but now the university, the entire public school system, the regional events center, and over 200 businesses in the area all have bilingual signs. And it didn't cost any money. It was just an entirely grassroots effort. And I think it spoke well. I went and bought tires, and my non-native mechanic, I was like, okay, what's the damage? I've been using this guy for 20 years. And he said, we're all done, paid my bill, and he says, how miigwech go and meanwhile. And I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. And he just picked it up from the online free talking flashcards that were growing out of this program. That doesn't fix all the big problems, but what it does do is it creates some safe space where we can talk about the big problems. And ultimately, That's my answer on the terminology piece too. You got all these competing terms, and some people are really wedded to one or the other. But ultimately, I think we need safe space where people don't have to walk around on eggshells, where we can have a courageous conversation, where we can move that forward. And there's some really great material out there. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint if anybody wants it to. There's lots more stuff out there. But there's a great quote by Margaret Mead that says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." So that's you. All right, Miigwe, ciao, Fiji.